Here in the Northeast, we have an incredibly wide range of fisheries to choose from. From smallmouth bass in the mountains to giant bluefin tuna offshore, there's no shortage of options and waterways. Over the years, I've found that a kayak is a great way to explore all the fisheries we have in the Northeast, and it can really take you through an entire season of saltwater fishing, from the very start of the spring run all the way through the fall. I started kayak fishing almost 15 years ago. It was pretty uncommon then to see people fishing from kayaks, and that was really my main goal, was to get off the shore, get out a little further, and get to striped bass and get to fish that I could see in the distance, but I couldn't reach with a cast from the shore. The first kayak I had really wasn't designed for fishing. It wasn't very stable. It was a sit-inside kayak, and it was a paddle kayak. So you had to always have, both hands on a paddle. You had to put it down in order to fish, and you had to be really careful when fishing and landing fish to stay stable and to avoid tipping over. Once kayak fishing started to get really popular and more people started to get into it, it became less of a novelty. And so companies started to design kayaks specifically for fishermen. They tended to get wider, more stable. They gave you more room to put accessories on top. And really one of the big game changers in kayak fishing was the introduction of pedal-powered kayaks. And that frees your hands up so you can use your hands to hold a fishing rod. You can propel yourself with the pedals, keep a hand on the fishing rod, and stay fishing the whole time. So my saltwater fishing season starts on Cape Cod when the schoolie stripers arrive. That's usually mid to late April, early May. When they arrive on Cape Cod, the first thing they do is they go and they look for the warmest water. So schoolie striper fishing starts in the backwaters, it starts in the creeks and in the rivers, and usually that's on foot. So I'm wading, fly fishing, spin fishing to catch those first schoolie stripers. But once they start to come in a little heavier, the bigger fish start to move in, that's when I get the kayak out. Fishing these backwaters from a kayak is perfect. It's a great platform because you can be stealthy, you're not gonna spook the fish, and it really is kind of a nice way to start the season in these quiet areas and really enjoy those first striped bass.
Wow, another big swirl right here. Just kind of spooking fish as we go.
Even though they're not the biggest fish of the year, they're a lot of fun to catch from a kayak.
That.
So not too long after the first striped bass show up, we start to see the first wave of bluefish. And bluefish in the spring tend to be found in shallow flats and on sandy areas. Again, I love fishing for bluefish from a kayak at this time of year because I can stand up in the kayak and actually see them in these shallow areas. They can actually be pretty spooky. Being able to sneak up on them in a kayak is great. Throw topwater lures, throw soft plastics. It's really an exciting way to fish for bluefish, and it's a nice change from catching schoolie stripers while we wait for the bigger fish to arrive. So I can think of one spring a few years ago. It was mid-May, and Jimmy Fee and I found some bluefish feeding right off of a sandy beach. A lot of them were kind of just out of casting range, but in this cool area of kind of a shallow sandy flat. So I grabbed Chris Megan, we got the kayaks out, decided to go back there and use those to see how we could target the bluefish. It allowed us to chase the fish around as they moved across this area. You could see when you stood up in the kayak where the school was by the disturbance on the surface of the water. And it was just a really cool way to kayak fish and catch some surprisingly big bluefish for early in the season. So another great spring kayak fishery down here on Cape Cod, mostly in Buzzards Bay, is the black sea bass fishery. Typically black sea bass thought of as more of a bottom fish. Most of the year you're finding them in deeper water on wrecks, really a boat fish. But in the springtime, they come into Buzzards Bay to spawn. They come fairly close to shore, 20 to 30 feet of water, and kayakers from all over the Northeast have found out about this fishery, and they'll come to Cape Cod specifically to fish for black sea bass from a kayak. The big draw of black sea bass is that it's fast action. It's a lot of fun. They're not the biggest fish, but they're really cool looking. And usually when you find one black sea bass, you have nonstop action for as long as the tide runs. The other great thing about black sea bass is they're delicious. People catch them because you can keep a limit. The fillets are beautiful white fillets. I don't know anybody who doesn't like to eat black sea bass. So I've been telling Dan McFetridge and Ryan Lilly of Old Town Kayaks to come down from Maine and check out this black sea bass fishery because there really is nothing like it. So I got them to come down in mid-May. We left early in the morning, and before we went to the sea bass grounds, with the sun coming up like that, it was just too tempting not to go look for some striped bass. The first thing we did was head out and fish along a rocky coastline, see if we couldn't tempt a few striped bass before the sun got too high in the sky, and we moved on to the black sea bass fishery. I'm going big right now, throwing a big plug, trying to see if there's anything in that 20-pound size class around here.
There we go, I'm on. Little schoolie. Little guy.
That's a start.
Nice.
As the sun rose higher in the sky, we made the pedal over to the sea bass grounds. Even without electronics, it's pretty easy to find black sea bass. We were basically just drifting along in the current, jigging on the bottom with a bucktail and some gulp. And as soon as you find that first sea bass, we just keep going back up tide, working that area, and usually where you find one, you can find plenty. That was definitely the case that day.
I'm on. I grabbed the one underneath Dan's kayak. Oh, that's a cute one. Here we go. Better fish.
The other fish you catch a lot of when you're sea bass fishing is scup. Big scup you can keep as well. They're good to eat. But really, if you're trying to find the sea bass and get away from the scup, the key seems to be to go a little bit deeper. In Buzzards Bay, we're kind of looking for that 25, 30-foot range. When you get to that level, that's when you kind of get away from the scup and get into the sea bass. The other thing to do is once you find the sea bass, try to stay with them. A lot of times they'll be moving kind of in one direction with the current. If you're out with a group of kayak fishermen, usually if you kind of form a group and spread out a bit, somebody will always be on the sea bass. Once somebody catches one, we all race over to that guy, get on top of that area, and fish right alongside. And usually that way you can kind of stay on top of the sea bass school. Then, with a few beautiful sea bass in the box, we made the pedal in. So later in the summer, we start to see bigger striped bass, and they tend to be in more open water. So when we heard about a school of big striped bass north of Boston, out in open water, feeding on mackerel and some menhaden, I knew it was a great opportunity to get Dan and Ryan back down from Maine and try and put them on some bigger striped bass that we didn't really find when they visited us on Cape Cod. So on that day, fishing for big striped bass in the morning and into the daylight really needed live bait. So we jigged up some mackerel, put a few in the live wells that we had in the back of the kayaks, and then slow trolled the live mackerel around the area. The perfect way to target these fish, because they were in open water, was to cover as much water as possible. Keep an eye out for fish on the electronics, either below the boat or with side imaging, and basically try to slowly drag a live mackerel past them. It's really a great technique for kayak fishing, whether you're pedaling or using an autopilot kayak with a Minn Kota. It allows you to go at a slow speed and keep that mackerel swimming kind of naturally and bring it past the striped bass. So side imaging sonar has become really popular with striped bass fishermen. When you've got striped bass traveling in a school, but over a big wide area where they're not really relating to structure, you can use side imaging to look out 100 to 150 feet to one side or the other, and you know when you come across them, you can see the edge of that school out there. In the kayak, you know that that's the point to kind of turn the kayak, bring it right past them, and bring your bait, kind of swing it in front of those fish. It's really a great way to locate those fish rather than just doing it kind of blindly and searching in a grid pattern. You can actually move along in one area, locate those fish, and really narrow down where they are. I would say the question I get the most from people who see me kayak fishing that have never done it themselves, they say, well, what do you do if you catch a fish or catch a big fish? How do you land it from the kayak? And I think what people don't realize, first of all, is just how stable a kayak is. It's really easy to just get it close to the boat, and what you're trying to do is, maybe use your leg a little bit, and you're sliding it. You're not really getting it that high off the water. Again, the kayak's pretty stable, and it's just a matter of kind of sliding it up, putting it in your lap, unhooking it, maybe a quick photo. And then especially with striped bass, just get them back in the water as fast as possible. And also, that's really the fun, is when you do hook into a good fish or a big fish, it actually pulls the kayak. They call that the Nantucket sleigh ride. So when you're hooked up to a fish and it starts running away from you, it doesn't pull drag from the rod as much as it would if you were standing still. Instead, it's actually pulling the kayak through the water, and that acts as drag that slows the fish down. And that's really one of the biggest thrills, I think, in kayak fishing, is feeling a fish actually pulling your kayak through the water. So for kayak fishing, you really don't need specialized gear. You can use the same fishing gear you use from shore or from a boat. Once you get a little more into it, you'll find that there's certain things you like in a kayak fishing rod. For example, having enough length that you can reach around the front of the boat if a fish is running in front of you can be helpful. A shorter butt, some surf rods might have too long of a butt. Something shorter there is usually a little easier to deal with. But for the most part, you really don't need any specialized fishing gear. Use the same stuff you use, but you'll find that you'll use it in a different way when you're kayak fishing. Dan and Ryan definitely enjoyed that type of fishing. They got into some good striped bass, some bigger fish. I'm pretty sure Ryan got the what it was like to catch a big striped bass from a kayak, get the fun of landing one and pulling it on board. I also got the biggest striped bass that I've ever caught from a kayak that day. It was just a pretty cool day of having big striped bass in an area, feeding on mackerel, and to be able to catch them on live bait like that, it was just very cool. I love all types of kayak fishing, but there's nothing that I love more than kayak fishing for albies.
There we go. Oh, that was painful.
False albacore get people fired up. People love them. They go crazy. They get albie fever. I've caught them from shore. I've caught them from boats. But to me, there's just nothing like catching albies from a kayak. So false albacore or albies, they're incredibly fast. They come up quickly and feed on the surface. Then they disappear and go under. Catching them is all about kind of being in the right place at the right time, putting yourself in position where when they pop up, you're right there and you can launch a cast into them. It can be 2 or 3 seconds that they're there. That's your chance. And that's why I love fishing for them from a kayak, especially in a pedal kayak. Really kind of changes the way you do it. I fish with one hand on the rod, bail open, ready to cast, kind of just pedaling, steering, looking around. The second that I see a fish break, or sometimes I even just hear it first, it's just all about getting that cast in there as fast as possible, starting the retrieve. And usually, you know, when you're on a boat, you tend to kind of chase them around. When you're in a kayak, you're kind of just holding your position, you're looking, you're waiting. It's probably more like hunting than any other type of fishing that I've done, and that's what gets me excited about it.
A lot of fish. There we go.
When the albies are around, try to get in at least an hour or two of albie fishing every morning from September through almost the end of October. The albie bite tends to happen just after sunrise, and in the fall, the parking's easy. There's not as many people around on Cape Cod. I try to get out there every single morning, quickly launch the kayak off the top of the car, and be out on the water when those fish first start to show on the surface. When albies are feeding on the surface, again, an advantage of the kayak is you're stealthy. They'll stay up. You don't have to worry about the sound of a motor spooking them, putting them down, like sometimes you have boats with outboard engines will do that. In the kayak, you can usually get pretty close to the school. I've had moments out there where the albies are feeding right next to me, a rod's length away, almost too close to even cast. You know, being down at that level too, being down at water level where you're kind of looking at albies feeding, you know, not too far below where you're sitting, it just kind of puts you more in the moment. It's, to me, again, it's just one of the most fun kayak fishing experiences.
There we go.
One of my goals this past year was to try and catch an albie from a kayak on a fly rod. I'd never caught an albie on a fly rod before. The kayak puts you in a position where they come up pretty close to you, so not being a great fly caster, I didn't have to worry about getting too much distance out. It was a bit of a trial. I hooked a few that managed to do something crazy, swim under the kayak, tangle the reel. Eventually, I finally got one to the boat, finally got my first kayak albie on a fly rod.
Oh, there he is. There he is.
At the moment I went to land it, it snapped the rod, so I did lose a fly rod in the process. But I did manage to check off my kayak fly rod albies, so hopefully this year, this season will be a little bit smoother. As someone who loves kayak fishing, it's been really exciting to see more and more people embrace this sport and get into it. And if you've ever thought about kayak fishing, don't be intimidated by it. Kayaks today are more stable and easier to fish from than ever before. I highly recommend giving it a shot. Get out there, use the fishing gear you already have. It can introduce you to a new fishery that maybe you haven't been able to reach before, or it can bring you a new angle on a fishery that you love. It's just such a great way to experience all the different fisheries that we have in the Northeast.